When you are young, yes, you think Thoreau is kind of cool and very self-reliant, to use Emerson's term, and engaged with this society to a certain degree, goes to jail rather than pay his taxes, and therefore kind of by implication supports slavery and the war in Mexico. And then Emerson, by contrast, seems like kind of a sleepy, dreamy guy. And then you get, well, as I got older anyway, I kind of reversed those things. And Emerson, I thought, was the more powerful thinker. And Thoreau, it seemed like a little bit of a pose to a certain degree. But the truth is, if you spend 24 hours thinking about Henry David Thoreau, you will change your mind about him 3 or 4 times, unless you're already welded to some kind of orthodoxy. So we're going to spend an hour talking about him right now.
I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made.
So you're probably saying to yourself, wait a minute, this is supposed to be a show about Henry David Thoreau. Why are you playing a song that's the Lake Isle of Innisfree set to music? And the reason is because Yeats's vision is very close to that of Thoreau's, but also it turns out Yeats was kind of a Thoreau fanboy. And one scholar, I think it was Christine O'Connor, wrote about going to some Yeats exhibit that had all of his stuff at it. And she writes, lingering before Yeats's opened copy of Walden, I noticed a faint circular impression left by a glass that must have once rested on it. Somehow this ring stain struck me. It was an ordinary yet intimate detail, likely left by Yeats itself. I love that. That's very, very Yeats. So Henry David Thoreau, this is all because of an email we got from a listener quite a while ago, who I think it had come up in the reading the Midnight Library, and this person had knew all kinds of kind of negative stuff about Thoreau and wanted us to deal with it. Well, in a way, Thoreau is perfectly suited for the present moment. During the pandemic, when people were isolating, when people were baking and gardening, when the fragility of the supply chain was exposed, Thoreau did kind of rise up from the forest floor of Concord, and he was recrowned this household god. But in a different way, Thoreau is disastrously suited for the modern moment when reputations are debated and set ablaze by a handful of tweets written by people with spotty information and no regard for context whatsoever. The social media age kind of loves to pounce on inconsistencies, and Thoreau had a lot of inconsistencies. Of course, as Emerson, who was kind of Frank Sinatra to his Dean Martin in the Concord Rat Pack, the Transcendentalist Rat Pack, which I think makes Margaret Fuller Shirley MacLaine, which I really like. But, anyway, Emerson said a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. So we've got some big minds here to help us work out all these problems. With us is Alex Beam, an author, journalist, former columnist, current contributor to the Boston Globe, author of many books, including American Crucifixion. Also, just noted in passing, Alex and I will be spending all of eternity together after we die, because we went on a tour of a newly built Mormon temple together. This wasn't explained to me before we went on the tour. Not necessarily a choice I would have made, spending all of eternity with Alex. But that's the way it goes. Also joining us is Laura Dasso-Walls, a professor emeritus of English at the University of Notre Dame and author of Henry David Thoreau, A Life, which Robert Richardson called the best all-around volume about Thoreau ever written. I believe that's what he called it. And that's no small potatoes, because Bob Richardson actually wrote a really good biography of Henry David Thoreau. So when he says you wrote the best one, he's steering praise away from himself, which actually was kind of characteristic of him too. So we've got to get going here, and I've babbled along long enough. So Laura Dasso-Walls, maybe you could get us started here. Your book is positive towards Henry David Thoreau without overlooking a few wrinkles in the fabric. Make the case for him as that kind of powerful figure, that influencer, not just of Martin Luther King and Gandhi, but Emma Goldman and Tolstoy, and we just said Yeats, and I mean, kind of responsible for at least one Linda Ronstadt song. So make the pro-Thoreau case in a nutshell.
Well, thank you, Colin. One thing for sure, Thoreau got noticed, which is really interesting because this all happened for the most part after his death. So somebody's out there putting his message out in the world, and now here we are celebrating. My biography came out for his 200th birthday, and has more fans than ever before. So how to make the case quickly. I wanted to subtitle the biography, Henry David Thoreau, A Whole Human Life. My publisher decided to go for simplicity, which makes sense for Thoreau. But the intent of my biography was to try to make the case for Thoreau as, and the phrase is his own, living a whole human life, so that we know the Thoreau who comes down to us through his writing and a kind of aspirational Thoreau. I wanted to fill in the backstory and the sort of richness and wealth out of which that life came. So there's a kind of dual purpose here. In terms of making the case for him, Thoreau was, one way to put it, in terms of contemporary relevance, on the verge of what we today would call the Anthropocene, the changeover from a much more less commercialized society toward a much less individualized society, more of a mass society with heavy industrialization, heavy ecological destruction. Thoreau observed all this. He went to Walden Pond to observe it and tried to think through both what are the conditions that are changing the world that we live in and the planet that we live with, and how should we both individually and socially respond to this change? And if we imagine ourselves into the future, what might the future look like? And are we so sure that what we're doing now is the best way to create a future for our posterity? Of course, these are questions that are very dire and very urgent right now, because now we really do sense that change is needed, or the road that we're going down will not take us to a good place. Thoreau foresaw that way back in the 1840s. And in that sense, he becomes a very early warning. I think of his position as a watchtower. And he's trying to warn us of conditions coming over the horizon and tell us that both the natural world and the human social world will not be good places to be unless we start thinking through more carefully our ethical response to the world and to each other.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think that area, that kind of north end of the pond and the surrounding area, at that time was far from being a forest primeval. It was probably about as denuded of trees as it was ever going to be. Charcoal burners had gotten in there. They were cutting down trees for railroad ties. I think Emerson's hope and expectation was that one of the things Thoreau would do on his land, on Emerson's land, was plant some trees. Which
Thoreau did. And you're exactly right. People think of it as the primeval woods, and it wasn't at all. It hadn't been for many thousands of years, of course. This was a very carefully managed landscape from the indigenous Americans who had been there for thousands of years before. By the time Thoreau was at Walden Pond, the forest he knew in his childhood was long gone. And it was right in that moment, in about 1850s, when he was writing Walden, that most of the trees were gone. So he's writing a kind of elegy or a kind of a wish, dream of what the world was and could be again, but it wasn't reflecting the world that he actually saw, which gave him great pain.
So, Alex, I mean, we should say that Alex Beam, in his many years as an esteemed columnist for the Boston Globe, one of Alex's specialties was writing columns that would prick the sensibilities and assault the shibboleths of whatever remains of the Boston Brahmin world. So you've had some interesting things to say about Thoreau, but maybe we should begin with, one of the ultimate ironies, which is Walden Pond and Concord, having become big tourist attractions. I mean, in a way, a whole other desecration has taken place of that area because it's swarming with people.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point. And I should say parenthetically, I would much rather listen to Professor Walls discussing Thoreau than have to read that nonsense myself. He's incredibly articulate and makes a selling case. Yeah, I mean, it's, there's that ridiculous euphemism. But yeah, Walden Pond is extremely stressed and has been for 10 or 15 years. There's been a sort of jihad to kick the swimmers out of Walden Pond. There was a subculture of early morning swimmers. There's been something of a crackdown on them. I used to try to go there maybe 15 years ago, and the parking lot's full by 9 a.m. I alerted you. I know everyone on this phone call at least is aware of there was the whole kind of, this really is ancient history, but Don Henley, the front man for the Eagles, was going to quote unquote save a portion of the land around the pond, which I suppose he did. But the Concord dump is almost immediately adjacent. So yeah, it is an irony. If indeed, Thoreau was broadcasting an alarm of this kind of tension on our lands, and I don't know his work well enough to confirm that, but yeah, it's extremely ironic.
Right. The Walden Pond, I think at one point maybe still does have one of the highest concentrations of human urine of any pond or lake in Massachusetts. No. So we're number one. So, Laura Walls, one of the many indignities heaped upon Thoreau in modern life is the fact that in the series on Apple Plus, Dickinson, he is portrayed by the comedian John Mulaney, who kind of pulls out some of the worst thoughts that people have had or ways in which Thoreau has come down to us as a less than appetizing person. I think they even go there with the whole idea of his mother doing his laundry. But let's just hear, this is actually a little clip from this series Dickinson, which is about Emily Dickinson.
Everyone really makes it big during their lifetime. They become insufferable. Emily Dickinson didn't get to become big in her lifetime. Henry David Thoreau did, and he was insufferable.
You're a dick.
Never meet your heroes.
Never meet your heroes. So we need to deal with this a little bit, Laura. There's just a way in which Thoreau has been kind of thrust at us as this guy who wasn't any fun, was didactic, was cut off from humankind rather than actively participating in humankind. It's not just mean old Alex Beam. It's also Catherine Schultz did a pretty vicious takedown, which in the physical copy of the New Yorker that it ran, the headline was Pond Scum. So, I mean, what about all this? I mean, see, I've already asked you to sort of paint a favorable picture of Thoreau, but let's kind of address some of this stuff. And we may have to begin. I don't know why, but the whole idea of his mom doing his laundry once in a while has really stuck to him like a piece of toilet paper on his shoe.
Well said. Yeah, I agree. And Rebecca Solnit wrote a wonderful piece on this where she asks, why is it that we expect him to do his laundry? Would you please name, and I don't remember, she says 1 or 3 or 5, but male writers of his stature who made a point of doing their own laundry. Thoreau, of course, it turns out that he did try. He took his laundry to Walden Pond and took some stones and tried to scrub it and tried to figure out, and I'm sorry, that's not a practical way to do your clothes. So he ended up bringing it back. And of course, his mother didn't do his laundry. The Irish servant did the laundry. His mother ran a boarding house, which was Thoreau's home in town, which is one reason he was so anxious to get to Walden Pond, because a boarding house with 10 or 12 or sometimes upward of 16 or so people living in it is quite a bustling, busy place. And he had chores to do there, which is one reason why he made sure to go home once or twice a week to tend to his family chores. He just doesn't tell us that in Walden. So, where to begin? On the one hand, let's say this. Thoreau was not somebody who needed to be liked by everybody, and he was somebody who didn't like everybody. which is perhaps unusual. And I actually have never expected him to like me, or at times I don't particularly like him, although I love him like a brother. So that's one thing, is that he was quite capable of being curt and rude and impatient with people, and often defensive. He was profoundly introverted. Think of the most introverted person you know and sort of, square that. And you have Thoreau. There is even some talk, and I am not qualified to judge this, that he might have been, well, on the autism spectrum, or at least neuroatypical, which is an interesting way to think about some of his differences. Late in life, a short life to be sure, he said people were so nice to him when he was dying that he said, I had no idea. I would not have been so mean to everybody if I'd known how genuinely good everyone really is, which just breaks my heart. So there's that side of his personality, and his the way he perceived the world and processed it. On the other side, the family side, yes, he was a beloved member of a large and loving family. He never left because he couldn't imagine himself living anywhere else. He left briefly, and that just underscored his thought that he had to be there in Concord with his family, part of that great expanded family, kind of a wonderful little collective, working in the pencil factory and helping out with the boarding house and so on. So that's the side that he doesn't write about, because he projects a kind of ideal self. But the question of the family life and his friends in town, Walden was right next to town. If you go there, it's about a 20-minute walk, if you're a fast walker. And he went into town every third day or so to visit with friends and to see his family. And because he loved his friends and he loved his family, and he was beloved in return. And of course, if that's a problem, then I'm a little alarmed by that interpretation.
Well, that's an interesting point. And so, Alex Beam, there is a sort of sense in which Thoreau catches a little bit of crap for being some kind of, precursor to Ted Kaczynski, sitting out there in the woods and like not having anything good to eat or drink, and kind of getting into that and rejecting technology, rejecting every possible advance in technology. Railroad, no good. Telegraph, no good. Sounds very Unabomber manifesto. But he also takes a lot of crap for not being Kaczynski enough, right? He takes a lot of crap for going into town every couple of days and like just hanging out with normal people.
Yeah, that I hadn't ever made that direct connection to Kaczynski, who I had a bizarre obsession with a while back.
We'll discuss all of this stuff in the afterlife, Alex. We have thousands and thousands of years ahead of us together.
There's a Ted Kaczynski archive, actually, in the Anarchist collection at the University of Michigan. That's probably where Thoreau's touch would be. We haven't mentioned, of course, him burning down the forest. I'm sure there's a great explanation, slash sort of exculpatory angle on that. I was sort of interested in this idea, and Professor Walls that he was, well known in his time, because among the very few authors who've had their books remaindered, and I'm sure that doesn't include Colin McEnroe, Thoreau's the patron saint of remaindered books, because of one of his most famous quotes is, I'm sitting in a room surrounded by 1,300 volumes of my own creation, and I think I'm perfectly willing to be corrected on the facts, but basically he's talking about unsold copies of Walden. I think the printing was something like 2,000. They sold a few hundred. This is, of course, warms every author's heart who's seen printings go awry. So I'm very curious. Everything I find myself talking about Thoreau, and even in this conversation, is we're talking about the penumbra of Thoreau, the shadow cast forward in time. I guess I've made the case elsewhere that I'm far from convinced that he, quote unquote, spoke for America the way he's come to have been assigned a megaphone by residents of the 20th and 21st century.
So, Laura, I mean, one thing I think we could maybe all agree on is that the first, I don't know, 100 pages or so of Walden are not easy to read. I mean, there are ways in which Thoreau is a really exciting prose stylist at various moments, but if he's having problems with the remainders, it could be just because it wasn't that much fun.
Well, yeah. And by the way, just a correction, it was actually his first book, A Week on the Concord Merrimack Rivers, that was remaindered. Okay. And yes, all the copies went to a study in third floor attic. He had to carry them up there himself. The stairs were tall and narrow, and he was very aware of those unsold books. And it actually was instructive for him because the book wasn't marketed, and it had good reviews, but when Walden came out, he knew what not to do, and Walden actually did fine. It was briefly out of print, but was reprinted as soon as he died, and has been in print ever since, etc. Anyway, wow, where to start? I think he didn't mean to speak for America, but in a sense to America against certain aspects of America. So let's take technology. This was a very sort of go ahead. Technology is the future, and anything that's technological is good. And let's create a technological utopia. And Thoreau was himself an inventor. He loved technology. He invented the number 2 yellow pencil. You don't know that because the system he used was taken over by a big company, and pretty soon that they were the ones manufacturing the pencils that we all remember from our childhood. And he invented the machinery to make it. Thoreau was fascinated by machinery and very, very good. He's the kind of guy that you called to repair something. He's fascinated by railroad engines. He made a point of touring factories because he wanted to understand engines and how they work. What he was against was worshiping technology for its own sake. And he felt that technology, if you sort of fetishize it, would take over. You had to always remember the human relationship to technology. So when he was touring factories, he talked to the workers, and he was both admiring of their dexterity and their skill, but he was also worried that the labor issue was demolishing their freedom as free human beings. And these were mostly women. He's speaking to the textile mills at Lowell and so on. So gosh, that sense of standing up and kind of saying, wait a minute, are we so sure technology and the railroad, for instance, is this to be worshipped, or is it to be like, you can ride the railroad, but think about what you're doing. He'd be the kind of person today who'd say, okay, yeah, you can have a cell phone, but why don't you turn it off a lot of the time?
Right. I should say that in the third segment of the show, we are going to talk to somebody who helped design a Thoreau video game, which is really kind of cool. Yeah. So
Thoreau would have loved it, by the way. Thoreau he'd be delighted by that video game, believe it or not. Yeah, this is art. It's an art form. And Thoreau was about creating art. What do you do, if you're anti-technology or you're guarded, like, I don't know so much about technology, he would say, well, use it to create and develop and to become, more fully human in the world.
One thing I think we do know that he would have done about cell phones or smartphones was probably talk a little bit about the workers who assembled them, because I think, right, Laura, that he would say things like, for every X number of miles you go on the railroad, that's a dead Irishman who worked on these things. There was kind of a sense that of pay attention to where the stuff that you are using and enjoying your so-called advances came from, and over whose dead body, literally, they traveled.
He does say that literally. The railroad tracks run over the bodies of the dead Irishmen who built that railroad, and you should know that, and you should change the way you think about railroads. And I think this is all in that long, very contentious, cantankerous first opening chapter of Walden, which is a tough read. Nobody likes to be, chided, reminded of all these sort of ugly undersides and all the things we don't want to think about. And he's there sort of wagging his finger in our faces saying, do you understand what the damage you do to yourself, your life, and to the lives of others by living this way? And it's really a tough read. it takes a certain kind of person to make it through that first chapter and keep going. The interesting thing there is that the book is the product of the angry young man who, yes, he accidentally let the fire get out of control and took out a big chunk of forest. And he took some real ugliness from his friends and neighbors for that, and really it made a deep impression on him. So he's angry, he's guilty, he's shamed, he's off sides. He can't, he's tried lots of different jobs. His sense that something is awry both with himself and the world. He's angry. He goes to the pond angry. And boy, is that first chapter full of anger. And the rest of the book is a healing. The second chapter takes this turn. Let's sit with the causes of our anger and the causes of illness in our society and evil in the world, and try to that's what we'll do here at Walden, and bring the reader along. And then the whole book moves us through this process of rethinking everything around him and coming to this grand moment of healing and hope at the end. So it starts angry and furious and alienated, and then moves us through a kind of ceremony of resituating ourselves in the reality of our world and orienting ourselves to hope.
So Laura, you're going to hang out with me in the next segment, but I only have Alex for a little bit more because he has to go sculling or whatever it is that you do with your time these days, Alex Beam. But, just to sort of build on something we were talking about before, I think that there is, even in Thoreau's aversion to technology, he has that whole thing about the transatlantic cable and perhaps the first news that will leak through into the broad, flapping American ear will be that Princess Adelaide has the whooping cough, which raises the possibility he may have inspired Guys and Dolls as well. But there is sort of a thing where I think in the modern moment, we don't entirely enjoy all the technology. I was just listening to Emily St. John Mandel talking to Ezra Klein about the idea when she writes something like Station 11, she's really kind of tapping into a sense that we wouldn't mind having less technology. It doesn't entirely make us happy. So I don't know. Play with that idea a little bit, Alex.
I don't know. I feel bad. I'm kind of impatient with, and maybe patience is like the problem between people who are interested in spending time with Thoreau and the people who aren't. And I apologize for not answering your question, although that's certainly a politician's trick to answer a question that was not asked. While Professor Walls was talking, I was skimming Thoreau's plea for Captain John Brown, and it just reads to me like just complete fictional fabrication, hypocritical nonsense where he's defending a man who led his sons to behead unarmed civilians in Kansas and making this eloquent case for it. Why are we talking about him in such hushed and pious tones? Technology, I think I politely disagree with you, Colin. Emily St. John Mandel is an unbelievable writer. And yes, technology makes everybody a tiny bit jittery. Facebook being the classic example, where if you read the New York Times or the Atlantic magazine, you'd think it's a conspiracy to establish world dominance on the part of some kid who got kicked out of Exeter. But in fact, tens and if not hundreds of millions of people, including you and I, are connecting ideas on Facebook, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I'm kind of having my mini Vesuvius of impatience with a lot of these polite arguments.
All right. Well, that was vintage Alex Beam.
Luckily, I'm about to go off the air.
That's right. All right. Well, Alex Beam is going to go sculling. He is the author of many books, including American Crucifixion, still a current regular contributor to the Boston Globe. He's going to leave us. Professor Walls and I are going to be back together on the other side of this break.
Shirts and a couple of pairs of pants which nobody really wanted to touch. Mama come in, she picked up a book and Papa asked her what it was. Someone else asked, what do you care? Papa said, well, just because. Then he started to take back the clothes and hang them.
All right, we're back. We're talking Henry David Thoreau, and we're doing that right now with Laura Dasu-Walls, Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Notre Dame and author of Henry David Thoreau, A Life, among other books. I apologize for how short this segment's going to be. I need to leave a little bit of time for the aforementioned video game. But, Laura, there's a couple areas I would love to get into with you. One of them, because I think it's actually something, it's one of these other things that doesn't come out that much. The other thing that I think, correct me again if I'm wrong, could be said about this area where he's living at the time of Walden is that the other people living there are kind of outcasts. They are freemen and freewomen, freed slaves. They are Irish laborers. They are people who are not welcome in the society of nearby Boston. That Thoreau really has positioned himself. He may be a 20-minute walk from town, but where he is where people live who really aren't even welcome in other places.
That's right. And by the time he's there, he remembers many of them from childhood into his earliest adulthood. But by the time he's actually building his house there, they're gone. And so one of the chapters in Walden, former inhabitants, he remembers them, recollects them, and he actually has done quite a bit of research trying to recover their lives. And these are freed slaves, poor people, immigrants, who each of them has a story that he tries to tell. And so his question is, well, first of all, why didn't this little collective form its own little thriving town itself, kind of a little neighbor village to Concord? And he imagines himself founding a new town, a kind of utopian collective. And that's actually seriously what he thought his house might become. It didn't work out that way. And the other aspect of that is the chance to tell of the social history of the pond in terms of these wild spaces, or this, again, we said earlier, cut over land because it was utilitarian. The pond was where kids went fishing and swimming and so on, long tradition of that. So the question of, what are the, now I lost my train of thought, sorry.
Well, let me just direct you in a parallel direction. The thing that I think also comes through to me now, which I'm not sure I got, like, let's say in college all those many years ago, is that, I think Thoreau kind of sometimes gets the rap of being, maybe all transcendentalists do, of kind of living inside his head a little bit. He's clearly consciously becoming the embodiment of his own ideas. He is enacting his own set of beliefs in the way that he's living. But I think there's this other idea, well, he's just thinking about a lot of stuff. But my sense now is that he kind of is rolling up his sleeves and getting to know some of these people who aren't well-born. He is interested in the plight of the Irish. He is genuinely interested in the plight of Native Americans. And I think not just on the printed page, but like getting out there and talking to them.
Yeah, definitely, more and more so. And it's something that grows on him. The more he knows, the more he wants to know, and the more he seeks out, the marginalized people. And this was the sense that I was driving at. The Walden Pond at this point was where you went if you had no money. It was the land nobody cared about. So it was like the wrong side of the tracks, the wasteland on the edge of town that you just sort of shoved all the stuff you didn't want to think about. And so he goes there and pays attention to all that. And it becomes, as he meets some of these people and has these conversations with them, he starts to think more about their lives and what kinds of alternatives they might offer, and perhaps sympathy, trying to raise awareness of so-and-so needs help. Can we make sure that, this child has a proper coat, for instance, because he's going to school and bare feet in the winter, needs new shoes. Little charitable moments like that, but larger, this whole notion of, number one, defending, we haven't spoken of slavery, and this is America in the midst of the pre-Civil War crisis of slavery. And this is why he's defending John Brown, because he's desperate for a solution that will end the violence against enslaved Americans. And then the other, of course, the Irish immigrant laborers became a cause that he took up. And the Native American, again, he went up to Maine, especially his second and third trips up to Maine, in order to understand more deeply the lives of the Penobscot, who were living in their traditional homelands, pursuing their traditional life ways. And this was the direction that Thoreau was pursuing when he got the final bout of tuberculosis that killed him. So we don't know what all that was becoming, but we do have a record in his writings. So, in that sense, he felt marginalized himself, and he did tend to identify with the more marginalized, even though, as I said before, doesn't mean that he liked everybody, was nice to everybody.
So, hey, I've got one last question for you. And this is a question about which you can and have given full-length lectures about. So I apologize for the fact that I literally have 4 minutes for us to talk about this. But, there's a way in which the women behind Thoreau, like as was so often the case in so many of these scenarios, and I should say, just for bona fide's sake, that it was quite a few years ago, but we did a big episode about Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller was like the action hero of this whole group. I mean, she was like the first woman war correspondent and all kinds of stuff. But there were women in Thoreau's life, women in Thoreau's family who helped him be who he became. And maybe just in what is now 3 minutes, you can kind of sketch that out a little bit.
Okay, Margaret Fuller first. I think she and Thoreau had a good, close relationship. He kind of a big sister, little brother relationship. And she gave him the best advice about writing and becoming himself that anybody did. And so I don't know that we'd have Thoreau without Fuller. We also wouldn't have Thoreau without Cynthia Thoreau, his mother, who was a brilliant, vivid, strong personality. And, she was one of the town do-gooders, right? Always getting into social causes and trying to make the world a better place. And, part of the Anti-Slavery Society, one of the founding members. And so that got the whole tone of the family was set by Cynthia's activism, which the two Thoreau sisters, his elder sister, Helen, was his moral lodestar. She actually became friends with Frederick Douglass. And if her health had been better, she would have been much more better known as an abolitionist herself. But then his little sister, Sophia, everybody called her Henry in skirts and said, she was like a twin. And what have we lost by not having more about Sophia's life? They would go on excursions together, walks, and she adored her brother, loved his writing. And after Thoreau died, she's the one who made sure that his writings would pass on to future generations. Without her, I don't think we'd know who he was. So not only did she help him and sort of, be the sister that he needed during his life, she was the one who made sure that the papers came down to us intact and in good shape, such that and collected people around his reputation and protected him and made sure we understood the worth and value of her brother as a writer.
Laura Dessous-Walls, I could talk to you for much longer about all this, but it's a 1-hour radio show, unfortunately. Professor Emeritus of English at University of Notre Dame and author of Henry David Thoreau, A Life, among other books. Thank you for your time today. We're going to take a break. We promised you a video game. I don't even like video games, but here we go. Did anybody get the musical joke before? Because when we were planning the show this morning, I was saying, well, we have to play different drum. The Stone Ponies Linda Ronstadt too. See, different drum, different drummer. I feel like these things just fly by people. but I was very excited about that idea. All right, we're going to talk about video games, a particular video game. But before we do that, time to thank Dylan Reyes. He's on the control board, in the control room, whatever it is that people who are in control do. He is doing it right now. And our senior producer, Lily Tyson, is the producer of this particular episode. And now joining us is Tracy Fullerton, a professor and director of the Game Innovation Lab at the University of Southern California and the designer and director of Walden, a game. Tracy Fullerton, welcome to our show.
Hi, it's great to be here.
So, Laura was saying during her time that her book came out to coincide with the 200th centennial of Thoreau. I think that this game kind of was timed the same way, right?
It was, exactly. I wish I'd had Laura's book while I was working on the game. I had Richardson's, and I loved reading Laura's book as it came out post the launch of the game.
And so tell us, just give us the kind of structure of the game. If I were playing the game, what would I be doing?
You play as Thoreau, and you essentially go down to the pond to live simply in nature. So it is a loose adaptation of the book. It starts in summer when he went down to build his cabin, and it ends in the spring at that time of healing that Laura was referring to. It goes through 8 seasons because Thoreau didn't believe that 4 seasons were granular enough to really describe the changes that nature went through. So it goes through 8 seasons of change, and each of the seasons will bring new challenges for the player as they live in the woods, but not only in terms of living in the woods, but also in terms of the complex relationships that you find that he has with his mentor, Emerson, with his family, represented by Sophia, and with his colleagues and friends, including Margaret Fuller, Horace Greeley, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and others who make an appearance in the game.
Yeah. We didn't get to mention Horace Greeley at the beginning. Horace Greeley is kind of responsible, Laura believes, I think, for some of the almost prejudices we have against Thoreau. He was kind of the publicist for the book, and he ginned up this whole story, this really kind of Kaczynski-like version of Thoreau in the years prior to the release of the book. And then that kind of stuck in a weird way, in a way that first impressions often do. So when you say that we're going to have some kind of contact with Sophia or Bronson Alcott or Horace Greeley or Margaret Fuller or Nathaniel Hawthorne, what's going to happen? Voices come to us while we're playing and tell us stuff?
They're letters, so letters shortened and adapted from writings and actual letters, where they will send you on different quests. So just as an example, Bronson Alcott will ask you to help with aiding fugitives along the Underground Railroad. And Horace Greeley will ask you to write a little shorter for the magazines in a better style than he thinks you're writing in. Emerson will ask you to help him with some research he's doing for an article. All of these people will generally correspond through letters.
So it's a first-person shooter game, but it's bean shoots instead of guns. Feel free to use that joke. And so do you get a chance while you're playing? I apologize for not having played it. I'm just useless with all kinds of video games. But do you get a chance to kind of be Thoreau personally? In other words, you hear these letters and stuff like that, and then do you sort of think, well, okay, I'm Thoreau now, so I'll decide to do X or Y?
Yes, I mean, so it's a first-person game. Yes, no shooting, just growing beans, building your cabin, fishing, doing sort of the daily tasks of living in the woods, and you get to make choices. One of the big themes of the game is about time. And I think Thoreau was very conscious about how we spend our times, and he questioned a lot of how we express our values through how we spend our times. And so in the game, there are many things that you could be doing, many people that you could be helping who will send you requests for help. And how you choose to use that precious resource that you have, which is time, whether it be to simply isolate yourself in our virtual woods or to go and engage with activism around slavery and abolitionism or the Mexican-American War, et cetera. You can make these choices. So when I say you play as Thoreau, you play in the situation, but you really make the choices yourself.
I'm sure everybody who talks to you brings up the obvious paradox here, which would be, although at the end of his life, I don't know how well known this is, Thoreau did have briefly dial-up internet. I think he had an AOL account, if in fact you're trying to decide what to do with your time, what you're going to do with your one wild and precious life. Thoreau might have said, "Don't play video games." So, how do you deal with that?
Well, everyone brings it up. It's an irony, but then I have to say, it is a similar irony to, say, staying in the house and reading a book, or, watching a movie. If we watched a movie about Thoreau, would that be considered ironic or a waste of time? I don't think so. Games are a medium. They do not replace the thing. In fact, the great hope for the game would be that it would inspire you, say perhaps as a young person, to go and read Thoreau, or to go for a walk in the woods if you happen to be, able to do that. But if you're not, you can take a walk in these virtual woods, and you can try to understand the situation that Thoreau had put himself into. And I hope that it will inspire you to think more about how you spend your time. Now, the game is not a massively huge game. It takes approximately 6 hours to play. So it takes about the same amount of time to play the game as it takes to read the Book of Walden. And one hopes that that's a sufficient amount of time to start to understand, the kind of ideas and philosophies that Thoreau is representing, and to then go off and live your life and bring some of that decision-making about time and values back to your own life.
So we probably have time for one more question. And I guess that would be, how did your relationship with Thoreau shift or alter? I mean, there's a lot of research that went into this. I think that's very obvious to anybody who's listening, that you didn't just decide to slap some images up there. You really got to know as much about this person as you possibly could. So what happened over the course of making the game in terms of how you view this guy?
It's interesting because Laura said this earlier in the show about, a whole human life, right? And I think that I, like many people, had read his writings, and I'd had at different times in my life different feelings. Like when I read him as a child, I was focused on the War of the Ants and all the stories about the animals and the plants and sort of life in the woods. And then as I grew older, I became more interested in activism. And of course, I became more critical, like everyone does, and, the laundry question. But I think in making the game, I began to understand some of the human tragedies and the human concerns of Thoreau as a person. And, one of the stories that really touched me was the death of his brother, which had occurred several years before he went to the woods. And what it means to me is that this trip to the woods was, as Laura pointed out, yes, one of anger, but I think also one of grief. And for me, dealing with grief alongside the building of this game in my own life, I started to realize how this timeout that he gave himself was also a part of a healing process for him in regards to losing that person in his life who was so important.
Yeah, his brother John is also the reason he got out of teaching. His brother John died of tetanus, or I think what they called lockjaw at the time, and it's one of the reasons he goes there is to the woods to grieve and process that, as you say, which also makes him, once again, a really good buddy for the pandemic. I mean, there's so many ways in which Thoreau is kind of getting us ready for all of this without necessarily knowing that. Tracy Fullerton, a professor and director of the Game Innovation Lab at the University of Southern California, designer and director of Walden, a Game. Thank you for being with us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And I just like to close by saying one of the things that's really been striking me a lot lately is just the way in which online culture, social media, I mean, it has its virtues, but one of the things it's really bad at is context. People tend to latch on to one thing, like his mother did his laundry, but about anybody. And then if it's a good thing, then that's a good person. And if it's a bad thing, that's a bad person. And our whole information environment these days is not set up for looking at people in terms of a whole life, the way you just heard. It's really, really bad at context. It's really, really bad at looking at gradations of good and bad. So maybe it's one reason to do a radio show like this one. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks to everybody who helped out. And we will talk to you again tomorrow.